So let's talk about the Guard battle tank that looks like it's set to reclaim its title as one of the most feared tanks in all of Warhammer 40k, with a full rules review for the mighty Leman Russ battle tank. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Imperial Guard once more, and it's time to do a proper review into the Leman Russ battle tank itself, perhaps one of the single most important units that the Guard has to offer, and these things seem to be some of the strongest things in the whole new book. In this video we're going to be going over the unit in full, we'll take a look at its box set, and then talk through its datasheet, a little bit of math hammer on the various turret weapons and their wargear options of choice beyond that, look at the damage output for one loadout, and then talk about all the various ways that we can get slightly more out of them with various buffs and synergy within the codex. Then we'll talk a little bit as to how I might want to field them in game and how strong they are compared with their various competitors within the codex. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. So first up, the Leman Russ battle tank comes in a couple of different box sets. You've either got the choice of the Leman Russ battle tank itself, which is the one that comes with the battle cannon, vanquisher, eradicator and exterminator, and the Leman Russ demolisher that comes with a demolisher cannon, executioner plasma cannon and the punisher cannon. They're a pretty iconic kit for the Imperial Guard. Most Guard players will at least have one of these, and they do fit in with the faction aesthetic pretty well, I think. Unsubtle and powerful, with enormous guns and heavy firepower, plus those nice World War I style sponsons. From Games Workshop, they're £36, €47.50 or $60, around about 2.8 points per dollar. Maybe not terrible within the greater scheme of 40k for getting points in the board, but not outstanding. If picking these up, I would strongly suggest magnetising. I've magnetised mine so you can take the sponsons on and off as well. There are some good tutorials online for which you can do so, and I must admit the time investment has definitely been worth it. It's really nice to be able to chop and change with different weapons with all the constant rules updates that 40k tends to have. The turret can even trade out some guns even if you just don't glue it. For example, the battle cannon and vanquisher cannon, I believe they can just slot in and out. If you're looking to pick them up in the UK, Element Games has them at a slight discount, £30.60 rather than the 36, so 15% off. I do have them linked down in the video description as an affiliate link that does also help out Auspex Tactics at no extra cost to yourself. I would bear in mind that it looks like there's supply issues with these at the moment due to them looking quite popular in the new codex. The main battle tank seems to be sold out in most places, including Games Workshop, though there do seem to be some demolishers about. I'm sure they'll get them back in stock, but that can be a bit variable from Games Workshop. I think that both the kits are pretty interesting at the moment. My favourite turret variants are the Battle Cannon, Vanquisher and Executioner right now, and there's some of those in either of the sets. Let's get into the rules though, and the Leman Russ battle tank in Codex Astra Militarum is 155 points base. That includes the whole weapon that you have to take, and for some nice simplicity, all the turrets cost the same, and all the whole weapons cost 5 points over the tank's base cost of 150. Unlike a lot of things in the Guard Codex that used to be able to be fielded in squadrons, the Leman Russ still can, so you can field 3 of them in one choice, and then have them split up and go their separate ways once you get them on the board. Otherwise, on their keywords, they have battle tanks and squadrons, which allow them to get certain synergies with other rules and stratagems and things. Squadron allows tank orders, though they won't be getting most reroll auras and things as they aren't core. The base stat line of the tank is pretty respectable for the points cost that it has. They move 10 inches, hit on 6s in melee and 4s at range, strength 7 and toughness 8, a big 13 wounds, 6 attacks, leadership 7, and a 2+ armour save. It does sound like they're not going to be receiving Armour of Contempt in the upcoming balanced data slate, but still toughness 8 and a 2+ armour really isn't too bad for that points cost, particularly given how destructive they are. In the current codex, it is quite an upgrade on the previous one, as well as turret weapon buffs. Their turret weapons now hit on a +1. They've lost grinding advance, which is actually quite a big buff, as it means that you can move and shoot at a full 10 inches without having to worry about things. It does mean that they're pretty mobile right now, and they also gained an extra wound. We'll go over their war gear in a little bit more detail in a second, but broadly speaking, you can take sponsons, either 5 points each for heavy bolters or heavy flamers, 10 points for the plasma or 15 points for the melters. On the top hatch you can take a heavy stubber or a storm bolter for +5 points each, and you can also take things like a hunter killer missile, armoured tracks and dozer blades, all of which are +5. The armoured tracks give you a +1 to your saves against damage 1 weapons, and the dozer blade gains the keyword and allows you to ignore movement modifiers. Quickly rattling through the turret weapon profiles, we've got 7 different options. The battle cannon is long range and quite general purpose. D6 plus 3 shots at strength 8, AP -2, and a big damage 3. That's going to be at least fairly effective against just about everything, and the range is very nice. The demolisher is shorter range at 24 inches, you only get D6 shots, so pretty swingy. Strength 10, AP 3, and damage D3 plus 3. It works out to be a bit better against hard targets, but a bit worse against heavy infantry. The Punisher Gatling Cannon gets 20 shots, strength 6, AP 1 and damage 1, that's the anti-horde choice. The Eradicator Nova Cannon is D3 plus 6 shots, strength 6, AP minus 2 and damage 2. This one's badly balanced, and a non-overcharged Executioner tank will generally beat it the vast majority of the time due to the extra AP and strength. Speaking of which, the Executioner Plasma Cannon gets strength 7 and damage 2 base with a big AP minus 4. You get D6 plus 3 shots, and you have the option to overcharge to a big strength 8 and AP minus 3, though if you roll ones to hit, then they do a mortal wound. Probably one of the best variants. It's particularly nice versus Armour of Contempt Space Marines. The Exterminator Autocannon is also pretty badly balanced, for some reason only 6 shots at strength 8, AP minus 2 and damage 2. It's just weirdly just flatly worse than the Battle Cannon in the vast majority of circumstances. I don't know why they didn't give it a few more shots. Finally, the slightly terrifying Vanquisher Cannon is just a single massive shot, strength 14, a huge AP minus 5, damage D3 plus 6, ignores enemy invul saves, and gives you an extra D3 mortal wounds when you do convert damage. This thing has big swings, it's either going to hit or miss, and even with a reroll it's not guaranteed, but the mortal wounds does mean that it's not entirely useless against things like heavy infantry as well, and it certainly is pretty spectacular against anything with high saves and high invuls. I did do a full video comparing various different Leman Russ turret weapons, and here are just some damage breakdowns of the various different guns. Broadly speaking, the Punisher Gatling Cannon is the one that you want to go for if you're killing hordes, though I do think that the Guard have quite a lot of good options for slaying light infantry. Things like lasguns and Kazakin are pretty efficient at that, and I'm just not sure that it competes that well. Otherwise, against heavy infantry like Space Marines and Terminators, the Executioner is kind of monumentally ahead of the rest of them. That AP minus 4 really gives it a big boost over the Battle Cannon, even if you are going to be dealing a few mortal wounds to yourself. Most of the variants are at least okay at taking out these targets though the Eradicator is just leagues ahead against the Terminators, almost doubling out its nearest rivals. Against Toughness 7 vehicles with no invul saves, the Executioner does win again, slightly beating out the Demolisher and Battle Cannon. The Vanquisher, despite its enormous damage output, is quite a bit lower in terms of averages here. Then finally, when you get onto really hard targets, against say a Toughness 8 target with a 5 plus invul and minus 1 damage, the Demolisher and Vanquisher beat out the Executioner here, solidly ahead, and the Vanquisher also has the advantage that doing a command reroll or anything isn't going to save you. The Battle Cannon and Executioner are still kind of fine, but it's kind of a win for the Battle Cannon against those kind of targets, as the Executioner might deal some mortal wounds and is shorter range. Finally, with a big tough Armour of Contempt target, something like a Votan Land Fortress, you'd get Toughness 8 and a 2 plus save. The Executioner wins against those ones, but only narrowly beats out the Demolisher and the Vanquisher, the Battle Cannon really dropping down due to the lack of AP on those. Broadly speaking, when it comes to Wargear selections, I feel that the Executioner and the Vanquisher are maybe the most interesting based on those comparisons. I feel like the massive extra damage increase against medium infantry is enough to mean the Executioner is worth the mortal wounds, and there are ways of mitigating those, including rerolls and not overcharging against relevant targets. As well as that, I would rate the Gatekeeper relic pretty highly, as we'll get onto in a second. In terms of raw power, that one does beat out pretty much all of the choices against the vast majority of targets on that list, particularly the heavy armour. Otherwise, for interesting choices, I feel like the Demolisher Cannon, Battle Cannon, and Punisher Cannon are all usable. I probably feel like they're not going to be the go-tos in optimised list, but they all seem perfectly usable for their intended roles, either long range or short range anti-armour busting or anti-infantry. Beyond turret weapons, I'd say the sponsons are basically auto-include good. 5 points for a heavy bolter really is pretty spectacular. Pretty much always worth bolting on if you can spare the extra few points. Even if they only fire once or twice per game, they'll have a very high chance of making their points back. I feel like they particularly like Born Soldiers as well, giving you a little bit more volume fire to fish for those sixes. If not taking them though, I think that the Heavy Flamers are pretty interesting for more aggressive Rosses venturing into the midfield. Particularly combined with a Whole One, their damage output can get really meaningful and give you a pretty meaty wave of Overwatch that light infantry just won't be able to charge you with. Otherwise, the plasma cannons and multi-melters both seem absolutely fine for the cost. If you really want the tanks to specialise in blowing away hard targets, then they seem worth the upgrade. I feel like the default choice will probably be heavy bolters or heavy flamers, and maybe just upgrade to those if you've got some other buffs and synergies that you're going to put on the tank. For the whole weapon, you've got the choice between las cannon, heavy bolter, or heavy flamer. I'd go with las cannon as the default choice for that one. For the same 5 points, I think it's just got a little bit more value than the heavy bolter. Though again, if you think it's one of the Rosses that's going to be on the front line and potentially getting charged, heavy flamers are perfectly fine. Finally, for the further upgrades, out of the rest of them, I feel like armoured tracks are probably the most interesting. 5 points for a +1 save against 1 damage will be useful against some weapons. The vast majority of things that are really going to threaten the Russes I feel like are generally going to be more than damage 1. But if you get hit by, say, a whole bunch of Thousand Suns combi Inferno bolters with +1 to wound or something, then the +1 to the save could be really meaningful. Bit of a weird one, that one. It really depends on how much the damage 1 fire is likely to come up. Perhaps a little bit more relevant if the Russ is going to be on the front line again, maybe taking attacks from things like Power Swords or Lightning Claws. Otherwise, I'd say the Stormbolter and Heavy Stubber are kind of borderline worth it. Out of the two, I prefer the Heavy Stubber, though for 5 points I think it's kind of take or leave. Maybe a bit better if you're taking Born Soldiers. If you think that you can have it firing 2 or 3 times per game, it's probably going to be worth the upgrade for 5 points. Definitely one to consider after you've already bought Sponsons though. Otherwise, I feel like the Hunter Killer Missile and the Dozer Blade are generally probably not going to be worth it. The Dozer Blade just seems flat out bad, unless you know you're going to be playing on a board with a whole ton of dense cover. Overall, for a fairly stock loadout, I feel like something like this could be pretty reasonable. A Leman Russ Executioner with heavy bolters on the sponsons and a las cannon on the hull. You could maybe swap out the bonus weapons for heavy flamers if you wanted this to be one of the frontline tanks. This one maybe more of the battle line range damage dealers. I do really like the way that these are pretty threatening against just about everything across the board. Against guardsmen you're killing about 6 of them, Space Marines around about 4, Terminators almost 3, around about 11 or 12 damage to a toughness 7 vehicle, or around about 4 or 5 wounds to a toughness 8 vehicle with a 5 plus invul and -1 damage. These things certainly put in work against targets across the entire board. The numbers are including Born Soldiers, but I think considering that you could be having easily 5 or 6 of these in a list if you wanted to, the sheer amount of shooting that you can get on them is pretty terrifying, particularly considering they move 10 inches and shouldn't be enormously hard to get line of sight on something. So if that's a baseline for the tank, let's talk about some buffs and synergies, and go through regimental doctrines, characters, stratagems, and tank cases. In terms of regimental doctrines, I feel like Russes are important enough for a unit that you might want to take regimental doctrines specifically to buff them, though I do feel that Born Soldiers for those auto wound on 6s really isn't the worst choice in the world, and it's pretty nice particularly for their heavy bolters and any lower strength or more volume fire attacks that they have. Otherwise, if you prefer Vanquishers to Executioners, then Elite Sharpshooters is pretty great. A single hit reroll each time you attack, and that means that your Vanquisher cannon will be hitting 8 out of 9 times, a pretty massive boost in terms of hitting power, and certainly in the comparison that we had before, if you factor in Born Soldiers on the Vanquisher, it'll be significantly ahead on a bunch of the armoured targets. To be honest, Elite Sharpshooters really isn't bad at all on Demolishers or Executioners as well. Demolishers, you're still re-rolling a very big shot each time, and the Executioners, the shot might be slightly less powerful, but you can choose to use the re-roll on one of their hit rolls of 1, and that can both potentially get you extra damage and also save you taking a mortal wound on yourself. Otherwise, if you're going very heavy on armoured units and fielding some sort of tank company, then Armoured Superiority could be quite nice. Counting as 5 models for objectives is pretty big, plus you could potentially combine that with objectives secured from a tank order. I'd say that those are probably the biggest 3. Heirloom weapons would be quite nice on the Demolishers and the Punishers though, 4-inch range is pretty meaningful on those. Swift as the wind certainly doesn't hurt them at all, 12-inch movement rather than 10 is good, and even better with tank orders. Trophy Hunters counts as 2 selections, and is generally going to be inferior to Born Soldiers, but some tanks will really like the +1 strength against monsters and vehicles. Knights certainly won't thank you for that. Finally, Blitz Division could be a way to get a few more tanks with line of sight on the enemy. It reduces the cost of strategic reserve, so you could have a bit of a flank march of a bunch of your tanks coming in on one side, hopefully all lighting up the enemy with some good lines of sight on their key units. Kind of depends a bit on what's going on with the rest of the list, but if you were going spectacularly Russ heavy, I think I'd be weighing up things like Born Soldiers versus the combination of something like Elite Sharpshooters and Armoured Superiority. Otherwise, there's plenty of characters that can help out your tanks. Certainly tank orders are probably the most important thing. They're all usable and they're all good. I suspect that most people will by default be going to Gunner's Kill on Sight for reroll ones to hit, particularly with Executioners, but just about every single one of the rest could be a better choice than that depending on the situation that you're in. There's a few different potential sources of tank orders. Probably the easiest is from tank commanders themselves, who also chip in with the damage output, though they can't order themselves. Otherwise, there's Lord Solar Leontus, the option to get them on an infantry character with a relic, I believe, or you could make something like a Rogue or Dawn battle tank a vaunted Praetorian and have that as a pseudo tank commander. Otherwise, besides the obvious damage boosts that I'd treat as the standard one, Pound Them to Dust can be relevant if you're targeting light infantry. Blast weapons count the target as double the models for triggering their rules. If it gets them to over 10 and you get an automatic 9 shots out of it, probably more worth it than the rerolls. Full throttle gives you a plus 2 inch to your move, and you get to counter stationary if you're advanced as well. Usually that's going to mean somewhere like an extra 5 or 6 inch extra movement and still shooting. That one could be very meaningful early in the game when you're trying to get line of sight on things that are hiding, or potentially even late game for objective grabs. Again, that one seems very nice to me. Blitz them is a potential countercharge type one, plus 1 inch to your charges, and when you make a charge there's a 4+ chance to deal D3 mortal wounds. A little bit unreliable, and I feel like most of the time something else is going to be a bit better than that. Sometimes it might be necessary though, maybe if you need to charge a Ross onto an objective and that's the only way that they can get there. Shock and Awe gives you the ability to gain objective secured until the end of your next command phase. Again, that one's very relevant if you're going very heavy on armour, as otherwise enemy infantry will just be taking away objectives left, right and centre, and you won't be able to score points. Finally, pinning fire allows you to shoot one infantry unit only. If you score 5 or more hits, then they get -2 inches to their movement. That one I think could situationally be pretty handy for certain units. I'd say perhaps most typically things like a big Terminator Death Star or something like that that's going to be slowly advancing up the board, or potentially something that you want to try and hit with a Death Strike missile launcher, and this is a way to slow them down so they can't move out of the way. In general, out of these, my favourite one's probably Gunner's Kill on Sight just for the raw extra damage, but Full Throttle and Shock and Awe both seem very powerful. The movement is great, and objective secured is going to be necessary for flipping points, and you can make that calculation fairly easily based on whether or not the tank's taking objectives. Beyond that though, there's a fair amount of other options of character support. Lord Solar himself can hand out 4 rerolls to a unit, and also just has flat 3 orders that can be tank orders as well, making him basically the most efficient source of multiple different tank orders if you want your tanks doing various different things as they advance. His range of ordering is slightly small though. Otherwise, various different warlord traits and relics are pretty meaningful for the Leman Russes. Gatekeeper I think is almost auto-include on a tank commander, an outstanding strength 9, AP 3 and damage 3 battle cannon with a big D3 plus 6 shots. It does basically flatly outcompete the vast majority of the other guns against most armoured targets. If you're taking a tank commander, then I'd take this, then you could potentially look at other things if you're taking a second one. I guess speaking of which, the tactical auto reliquary of Tiberius might be a second choice. I can give you an extra order for a tank commander, again giving you multiple flexibility options, such as one tank does damage, one tank goes faster to get a line of sight on something. Otherwise, Master Tactician is generally pretty useful with big, durable units that deal big damage. That can mean that you can either hide them if the enemy gets turn 1, or put them somewhere to get some line of sight if you do. Pretty nice for getting line of sight on the enemy's heavy hitters right from the go. Otherwise, Old Grudges is a pretty meaningful damage boost. You get to select one enemy unit, and the battle tanks around you get a +1 to wound. Really quite brutal on top of the Leman Russ's already good damage output. The enemy is not going to enjoy that on top of something like a Terminator Death Star or an Imperial Knight or something. Finally, there's a couple of other durability options. A Psyker can give Night Shroud and Psychic Barrier to a tank, 2 pretty meaningful durability boosts, maybe particularly nice if you've got a tank that you're throwing towards the front lines and you think is going to take a lot of heavy firepower. I'm not sure it's quite auto-include good at 60 points, but it certainly feels like you could save a lot of damage on your tanks over the course of the game that way. Otherwise, the Tech Priest Engine Seer also seems pretty reasonable for the 40 points that he costs. He grants a Leman Russ a 5+ invul save and heals D3 wounds on them each turn. Just theoretically, in Theory Craftland, if he manages to do that healing action twice, then he'll theoretically have restored more points of Leman Russ than he costs, so anything after that is a bonus, never mind the invul save. In reality though, he isn't going to contribute to actual aggressive damage as much as more points worth of Russ would cost, so I generally see him as a nice to have if you want, but not 100% essential. Out of all of these, I'd say that tank orders are probably the single best things. Gatekeeper is the other really standout thing on this whole list, but certainly Lord Solar and the durability characters are quite nice, as are those other warlord traits and relics. Moving on to stratagem support next, and the Leman Russes have a fair amount of stuff that can target them. Out of the majority of ones that are going to affect them quite a lot, I'd say the top ones are probably a bit more useful. The bottom 2 are maybe a little bit more niche as bonus damage dealers if you desperately need them. For one command point, Relentless is a very easy use if your Russ is on the bottom bracket. They count as top profile, so you'll be hitting on 3s with that turret gun rather than 5s. Almost always going to be worth it if you can spare the command point for it. Another one I really like is Vengeful Salute, just 1 CP on a Leman Russ, and it allows you to shoot on death with a turret weapon. The ballistic skill can't get a 5+, I believe that means that you'll be counting as a 4+ to hit due to the turret weapons rule still working. This one could be a really nice spanner in the works when you're attacking the enemy. An exposed Russ goes down, and then use the last breath of its turret weapon to hopefully kill something that's just about to inflict damage. Ideally, maybe smash a character or vehicle that's only got a few wounds remaining, or potentially ruin some fragile assault troops that are just about to charge. Well worth having the option for this if you can. Crush them, I'd say, is a bit more niche. Battle tanks or super heavies count as being weapon skill 4+ in melee. If they have the armoured keyword with the armoured plates, then it counts as a 3, and wound rolls of 6 also deal a mortal wound. Still doesn't make them exactly outstanding melee damage dealers, but if you need to try and crush maybe a couple of light infantry with bad saves, it should fairly reliably do this if combat is the only way that you can do so. The next two I think are probably going to be staples in smoke launchers and ablative plating. Smoke launchers are 1 CP for a -1 to hit, definitely make a Ross a bit tougher to chew through, hopefully means that the opponent's guns just won't go as far and you'll have more Rosses to strike back with. Ablative plating is a little bit more pricey, 2 CP on Rosses, -1 damage is pretty big though, anything that's damage 3 goes to damage 2, and damage 2 to damage 1. Probably most useful if you're being targeted by a bunch of those. Finally, I think it would be remiss of me not to mention the command reroll when applied to a Vanquisher cannon. Certainly rerolling a 1 to wound with that could be one of the most easy direct damage increases in 40k. Getting a 2+ chance or something to deal an average of 10 wounds to your target is pretty enormous. Otherwise, you can use Ingrained Precision for 1 CP, that's the Born Soldier one for a 5+ to auto wound the enemy, or Overlapping Fields to give you reroll wound rolls of 1, and 6s to wound gain an extra AP versus the target. Both of those I describe as merely okay in terms of damage boosts. I think you'll usually be able to do better within the Guard Codex, but if you absolutely just need to maximise damage output against one big unit, it's still good to have the options there. Out of these, I consider my staple ones to be Relentless and Vengeful Salute, Smoke Launchers, and Ablative Plating. All of those look like they could be stratagems that you might want to use multiple times in a game depending on what's happening, and certainly budget in some command rerolls if you happen to be playing with a Vanquisher or two. Finally, for various ways to make the Rosses even more scary, let's talk tank cases. And again, a whole bunch of those look usable, but maybe not enormously stand out. Running through them quickly, there's 20 points for Ignore's Cover, 20 points for Transhuman Physiology, 20 points to gain an extra Regimental Doctrine, including that Elite Sharpshooters one, which could be good, 25 points for a 5+ Feel No Pain type save against mortal wounds and a 5+ Invul, 25 for Light Cover at greater than 12 inches, and 25 to become a Steel Commissar and allow yourself to give Commissar orders out to infantry. I'd say out of those, perhaps the most interesting look like they could be Meticulous Calibrator. Ignores Cover for 20 points isn't bad at all, and that could be quite nice on something like a Gatekeeper Ross, where you absolutely want as much damage converting as possible. Would certainly help out against Space Marines in light cover, and of course anything in dense cover. Otherwise, I feel like the other really standout one might be the Veteran Commander one. That's 20 points for the extra Regimental Doctrine, but Elite Sharpshooters looks like it could genuinely be worth the extra 20 point cost. That's certainly worth it if you apply it to a Vanquisher tank. Might well save you some necessary command point rerolls, and with average dice usually nets you around about an extra 2 wounds per turn once you take into account the chance of missing or just hitting and not counting. If you can keep that firing at meaningful targets the whole game long, it's going to be well worth the extra 20 points. This one I think is also worth it on Leman Russ Demolishers and Executioners, even if they don't seem quite as obvious choices. Those tanks just have a lot more chance of actually triggering the hit reroll each turn, so even if you don't get to reroll such a big shot, at least you're almost certainly going to be rerolling a small shot, as some of the shots are likely to miss. It does mean in terms of average damage output, it's almost as good on a Demolisher. I'd say it's pretty similar in terms of value on the Executioner as well, as mentioned, it can save you from the reroll ones if you don't have tank orders. Otherwise though, the durability ones seem kind of fine, maybe not massively stand out for the 25 points that they cost. Knight of Piety is maybe quite good on one that's moving forward, and Master of Camouflage I suppose could help safeguard an important investment, say again could be alright on the Ross with the Gatekeeper relic. Overall though, I'd say that Veteran Commander for the Elite Sharpshooters will probably be my first pick, and then maybe Meticulous Calibrator after that. So in terms of practically putting on the field, how would I think about fielding Leman Russes at the moment? In general, I feel like the tank's strong enough that you can run a sizable portion of a guard list with these mechanical death machines. They're fast moving enough to get crucial line of sight, particularly with the tank orders, and they've just got pretty huge damage and defense. In a straight up firefight, not that much in 40k is going to be able to go toe to toe with them very efficiently. The enemy is going to need some dedicated anti-armour, and a fair bit of it to chew through the toughness 8 and the 2+ save. They do feel like one of the units that might excel even more in multiples as well, going back to the old way of just taking so much armour that your opponent really can't hope to deal with all of it. As mentioned, my probable go-to at the moment will be Executioner with heavy bolters and las cannons. That's be the mainline battle tank one. If you're running loads of them, I might consider one or two with triple heavy flamers if you're going to have some of them going forward and being aggressive, trying to scrap for the midfield. Depending on how many Leman Russ is being fielded, I'd take maybe one or two of them as a tank commander, probably the first choice with a Gatekeeper, though potentially one with a Vanquisher cannon and a single reroll regimental trait if I wasn't already taking it. If running a lot of Russes, I'd be quite tempted to take maybe one or two of them as Vanquishers, just to give you some hilariously deadly threats to any heavy targets in the enemy's list, and let the Executioners mop up most of the light ones. Could give you a bit of variation as to how you play it as well, and which tanks to have a bit more expendable depending on certain matchups. For support beyond tank commanders, I'd certainly consider things like Psychers or Tech Priest Engine Seers, though I don't think that they're 100% essential. And for the most part, I feel like they're one of the better units in the Guard Codex to spend command points on. Big damage and big toughness units generally convert command points into being useful quite well. In game, I'd be aiming to try as many of them as possible turn 1 and aim for the Alpha Strike. If taking an awful lot of Russes, then some are likely to be exposed and being hit by enemy attacks. You might be able to loiter them at the back of the board though and outrange a bunch of firepower. They do have the movement to be able to move forward and shoot quite effectively. I think how they're played will depend on the list quite a bit. If you're just taking a few of them, it's going to be more about screening them with infantry and having the infantry repeatedly sacrifice themselves on objectives and holding up the enemy. If you're going very Russ heavy and you actually want to play aggressively with them, I feel like you're generally going to have to do the same but with Russes. Probably use the heavy flamer type ones and use the speed or obsec type orders to hold down the midfield objectives while hopefully trying to table the foe as fast as possible. Particularly in the later turns, I feel like if you got intact tank orders, then they could have some big value. Getting the massive movement and the objective secured could really surprise your opponent and get your tanks right round to destroy the enemy in their home field or take objectives that seem far too far away to reach normally. Overall, with their sheer destructiveness, I do feel like a Russ heavy army in the Guard is pretty scary right now. So just in case you hadn't guessed from the general tone of the video, I'd say that Russes are currently top tier for the Guard. I would strongly expect to see Leman Russes run in the vast majority of competitive Guard lists, huge damage output, pretty reasonable defense, very decently fast now they no longer need to grinding advance, and some pretty awesome flexibility with the tank orders, objective secured, speed, or damage. Within the Guard Codex they certainly have a few competitors, the Rogue or Dawn battle tank maybe being the most obvious one, as a slightly bigger battle tank, but one that costs a fair few more points. I have done a comparison video comparing the two tanks if you want to check that one out. I'll link it down in the video description. In general, my takeaway from that is that the numbers are really quite similar, but in general maybe just a little bit less easy to use due to guns with very different ranges, so it might be better to have maybe one within a battle line of other tanks as a bit of a focal point for any buffs that you want to put on it. It's really quite efficient when you've got 250 points for anything for damage or defense on it. Could be kind of interesting to run one as a sort of a pseudo tank commander as well. Give it that vaunted Praetorian one, and then it can both order itself and other Rosses, at least until they FAQ it. Otherwise, for direct damage dealers within the heavy support section, the other competitors might be things like Hydras and the heavy ordnance batteries. In general, I would say that the Hydra is actually surprisingly effective in terms of raw damage that it spits out. If you don't quite have enough points for a Russ in the list and you've still got a heavy support slot open, I feel like a Hydra is actually a pretty credible alternative, kind of similar in terms of damage and defense to the Rosses, point for point. Obviously it's awesome against aircraft, but with the turret weapon special rule, it's really not that bad against ground targets either. For me, the heavy ordnance batteries have kind of similar damage outputs, but just lacking the extra toughness and maneuverability of the Rosses. They're generally going to be less optimal unless you're fielding those heavy ordnance batteries. Lastly, for potential competitors, we've got the armoured sentinels, which I think are also quite interesting. Compared with the Rosses, they're more durable, but generally have worse damage, even with loaded with the hunter killer missiles and maximal buffs from rerolls. It does make Sentinels maybe a decent choice for the first wave of targets that are going to encounter the enemy, make the opponent have to fight and deal with them. Their damage won't go quite as far on them, and then the Leman Russes can hopefully sit back and be a bit more safe, blasting away at the enemy for the rest of the game. Overall though, general takeaway, Leman Russes are very strong, and I expect to see them quite a lot. I guess we'll see how they fare in the tournament scene against the other big NASAs of 40k. If they really do turn out to be a bit oppressive, it's not inconceivable that Games Workshop might nerf them. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the Leman Russes and what your experiences are of them in the new codex. Are you going to be tempted to put a tank company on the table, or do you feel that a bit more of a combined arms approach is better, mixing in a whole bunch of infantry and scary Kazakin? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we'll certainly have more coming for the Imperial Guard, including plenty more unit reviews like this. If you'd like something else to watch, I have run a few numbers comparing the Leman Russ, Rogel Dawn Tank and Baneblade. I'll link that video down in the video description if you'd like to check that out as another one to watch. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.